say hello. My name is Rick Hills. I teach at NYU Law School, and I have the honor today of moderating a really exciting program on the control of COVID in Taiwan and Vietnam. With me today are Chuan-feng Wu from Academica Sinica, research professor in healthcare, international human rights, written some really interesting things on big pharma's duties to provide access to medicine, among others. That was one that really caught my eye. We also have, from Academic Sinica, research professor Wen-Tsong Chiou. He's written on privacy, data, biomedical and public health matters, but also empiricism and public law and what relevance it has to legal theory. And finally, Trang Nguyen, who is, in addition to being a professor at Temple University, Beasley School of Law, much more importantly, a former Hazard Fellow at US Alley. So actually an alumni. I'm writing on transnational business and authoritarian legality. Today's presentation gives us a great chance to contrast two totally different regimes in some ways. You know, a fairly open democratic regime and an authoritarian regime, but maybe government doesn't matter because both have done a pretty good job of controlling COVID. Maybe we'll find out why. I remember Alexander Hope said something about let fools on the best form of government contest. The government that's administered best is best. I'm misquoting him, but the basic idea is the form of government doesn't matter. Perhaps the experience of Taiwan and Vietnam prove that that's so, or maybe they just have discovered two different routes to a great outcome. What we're going to do is start with Taiwan, beginning with Professor Wu, going to Professor Chiou, and then go to Vietnam with Professor Nguyen. So I'm going to ask some questions after that. We'll have cross benches, and then we're going to open the floor to everybody in the audience. So without further ado, I want to call on Professor Wu for some thoughts on why Taiwan has been so successful.
Thank you for having this opportunity to talk about Taiwan's experience in COVID-19 control from the constitutional perspective. And as all countries, Taiwan is standing amid the global crisis of COVID-19. However, compared to other countries, the COVID-19 cases in Taiwan remain low. At this moment, 584 people are infected, with 490 classified as important and only 55 local. And the Taiwan's success did not come out of sheer luck. Actually, after the SARS struck Taiwan badly in 2003, Taiwan has reviewed the effectiveness and the disease control practice from different perspectives and tried to have government reorganization, medical system preparedness, and public engagement. And due to a time limitation, I will only highlight some response operations I think as essential and share them with you. And first, I want to talk about the centralized platform. A centralized platform was actually established very shortly after a centralized platform is established to command and coordinate agencies' actions. Inquiries. Taiwan's experience in 2003 actually shows that unclear rules and responsibilities in the decision-making process, especially the tension between local and the central government, might inappropriately interfere the public health emergency assessment and the delay precautions. Therefore, the CDC Act, the Disease Control Act, was amended to grant the Ministry of Health Welfare the exclusive power to recognize and announce the special announce public health emergencies. All other government agencies are required to coordinate and assist disease control measures under the command of the Ministry of Health and Welfare. Additionally, the government is also authorized to set up the Central Epidemic Command Center, so-called the CECC, during the pandemic which is authorized to coordinate a wide array of communicable disease combating measures. However, even though the allocation of powers among central and local governments seems to be clarified after the SARS outbreak, disputes still happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, especially when the local government decide to adopt more strict disease control measures. For example, recently in Taiwan, a local government, Zhanghua County, decided to implement its own COVID-19 control policy and try to have a screen policy and test all arriving passengers. The CECC again is against the local government's policy by arguing that the large number of false positives expected with universal testing could overwhelm Taiwan's medical system and harm the country's COVID-19 prevention measures. The premier even argued that the CECC is endowed with the authority to lead the communicable disease control measures and threaten to investigate the local government for ignoring central government rules. The local government then withdrew its own screen policy and decided to follow the CECC's order. And a similar case can also be found in lockdown measures and the distribution of budget COVID-19 fund. And in all these cases, local governments all withdraw their own policies under the CECC's pressures. But this kind of absolute total power of the CECC, of the central government, to unify, command, and supervise disease control measures at various levels was questioned. Critics argue that the central government might ignore the local government's role as a local democratic body, which is designed to respond to citizens' needs. To respond to this challenge, the CECC promised to enable more efficient, transparent communication with local governments and to include local concerns when developing disease control measures. And second, I want to talk about the rise of technocracy. During the SARS outbreak, over 1,000 people was actually quarantined in a hospital, irrespective of whether they are confirmed with the infection or not. And the constitutionality of the individual liberty restriction was actually challenged in front of the Constitutional Court. But the Constitutional Court's opinion is kind of divided. On the one hand, the court warned the government that the time limit for the compulsory quarantine should be set up, and adequate compensation regime needs to be established. But on the other hand, the court also affirmed that the police power of the administrative branch, the Ministry of Health Welfare, is recognized because of their perceived medical expertise during the crisis. And the court also distinguished between the deprivation of liberty during the public health crisis from that of a criminal case. The court acknowledges in this case that risk-based decisions during public health crisis is non-judiciable and that judiciary intervention should be minimal. And after the SARS outbreak, the CDC Act, along with the Constitutional Court's decision, catalyzed a paradigm shift towards a technocratic governance of public health in Taiwan. The Act, actually, the CDC Act, actually delegates a broad power to government where the Ministry of Health Welfare is afforded with a wide degree of regulatory flexibility to implement disease control measures necessary to contain the spread of disease. And the COVID-19 Special Act also reaffirmed the broad and unlimited delegation by authorizing the CECC commander to implement necessary response actions. Therefore, with this kind of broad authority and substantial discretion extended by law to the CECC, the CECC has implemented some strict, wide-reaching measures during the COVID-19 outbreak. For example, the medical personnel, civil servants, and the middle primary school teachers, students, and the staff were prohibited from traveling abroad, even in the very early stage of the outbreak, with a view toward maintaining human medical resources and avoiding transmission among vulnerable groups. And a citizen's name may be made publicly when she has unnecessary travel abroad. And the government also require mask wearing in public transportation and some public venues. And the public and the private institutions and the business are required to follow contact information-based visiting measures and to record visitors' names and the contact information. And even though the technocratic approach also, has so far been proved effective, some has shown concern over the potential misuse and abuse of the government power and the potential risk breaking fundamental rule of law principles. Several congressmen has proposed an amendment with more strict rules designed to strengthen democratic oversight, remedy rule of law deficit, and prevent systemic values. But unfortunately, the amendment was not passed in the Congress. And the third, I want to talk about the transparent risk communication and the fake claim. In order to make the complicated information regarding COVID-19 accepted by the audience, not only the government's decision, but also the rationale behind the decisions are transparent and mostly public accessible. The Taiwanese government has employed both formal and informal channels and has also worked with civic technology groups to facilitate two-way communication between the CECC and the public. For example, the CECC has been hosting a press conference on a daily basis and providing accurate and timely information. And another thing is that when the need for face mask raised in the early stage of the outbreak, the CECC also disclosed details about the production of face mask and disclosed details about the production capacity and try to reveal this kind of information to the society. So you can see this app is actually the civil society uses this kind of information to develop this app. And you can see the green triangle is all the pharmacies. And when you see the pharmacy nearby, you can see all the information about the pharmacy in the name, the contact information, and also how many face masks has been left in the pharmacy storage. So they use this kind of app to try to ease the society's anxiety. And the other thing is that the CECC, the government also use social media such as LINE as an important platform to promptly communicate with the society. This app is actually everyone can download it, and the CECC or the CDC will use this line to deliver immediate information about the COVID-19 to everyone who download this app. And the citizens can also use this app to communicate with the CECC or with the CDC immediately. And regarding the fake news and the disinformation, both Article 63 and the Social Order Maintenance Act and Article 14 of the COVID-19 Special Act can be applied. But it's very special for the COVID-19 Special Act is that this act has significantly increased the penalty where individuals who distribute false information regarding the COVID-19 may be sentenced to imprisonment and a fine for not more than 105,000 US dollars. However, the restriction measures also cause concerns about the restriction of freedom of expression, especially it is not clear what would be considered as fake news. So to balance the conflicts between the fight against the fake news and the protection of expression freedom, the COVID-19 Special Act actually states that an individual can be punished only when first the individual knows the news are fake and still intentionally distribute the news, and the second, the news or information has caused damages to the public. And finally, I want to talk a little about the big data application. During the COVID-19 outbreak, the Taiwanese government fully leveraged the digital governance infrastructure and the big data for effective implementation of measures related to the disease prevention, detection, and surveillance. For example, the government has actively integrated individuals' travel records from National Immigration Agency with other existing databases such as the National Health Insurance and even police system. Physicians then have a channel by which to access a patient's travel history through the National Health Insurance card. As we all know that Taiwan has a universal health insurance, so every citizen has a National Health Insurance card. So whenever a patient go to a hospital or clinic, the physician will have the national insurance card, and he insert that card. This page will pop out, and it will show the travel history of the patient or even the occupation of the patient. So the physician can easily to know the travel history of the patient or whether the patient is the high-risk population of COVID-19. And the other thing is that the government also used the National Health Insurance database, which contains the entire population's medical records to review all patients' health status and locate suspected patients. And some patients' daily routes explored through the surveillance camera or the mobile phone tracking was actually disclosed to the public so that people who have visited this place can be on alert. And finally, the government also established a monitoring system, so-called the intellectual surveillance electronic fence system. This system is established to track individuals through the GPS using their mobile devices and receive their daily health report to ensure individuals' compliance with the quarantine order. And the surveillance system is also connected to the police cloud computing system so that the police can easily identify those who disobey the quarantine order. However, despite their effectiveness, measures with their great potential to infringe upon individuals' privacy were not carefully scrutinized according to the constitutional principles. For example, even though the CDC Act and the COVID-19 Special Act authorized the government to impose quarantine, isolation care, and other necessary measures, it remained debatable whether linking multiple national databases, disclosing them, collecting mobile data, and analyzing surveillance data qualify as necessary measures and pass the scrutiny of fundamental rule of law principles. Human rights advocates also question that the privacy action mechanism is actually ignored in the policy-making process. And finally, I will just use a little time to briefly talk about the precautionary approach. Because when China decided to lock down Wuhan earlier this year, the Taiwanese government actually decided to take an exceptionally precautionary approach. Actually, last year, December 31st, Taiwan has required all passengers from Wuhan to be physically examined. And Taiwan also took the border control quite earlier compared to other countries. And the suspension of the exportation of medical masks was actually implemented on January 15th. There are lots of reasons for Taiwan to adopt this kind of exceptionally precautionary approach, even though this kind of approach might influence some people's civil rights, especially for those who studies or works in China. But this kind of approach was now actually quite supported by the Taiwanese society. And this is my presentation, and I hope we can finally beat this disease in the near future. And thank you.
Thank you so very much, Professor Wu. I'm going to call upon Wen-Tsong Chiou to help us with other aspects of the Taiwanese response. Wen-Tsong?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
We hear you
Okay.
fine.
All right. Professor Hills, Catherine, May, Chuan-feng, and everyone, good evening. Before I begin, I would like to say some things first. The first thing that I want to say is that I would like to express my gratitude to U.S. Asia Law Institute, especially Catherine, for inviting me to this wonderful event. Attending a symposium like this is something we created during the pandemic. It is quite efficient and effective, but I still wish someday we can meet in person soon. And the second thing that I want to say first is that I'd like to congratulate you on the achievement you have made last week. It may sound weird to hear someone like me who come from a third world country. I want to congratulate you on your achievement in democracy. But it is indeed not easy, especially in a polarized society. We have been there. We are still divided in many fronts. But strangely, the pandemic made people come closer together in Taiwan. So I believe that you will find a way to reconcile the difference someday. Now that the challenge of the global pandemic remains, it requires collaborations among countries. And that's why we are sitting here today to learn from each other's painful errors and hope to find a better solution together. So let me begin with this chart, the chart that Chuan-feng also showed you. This chart shows the number confirmed new cases in Taiwan spread out by the week of the year 2020. Shows the number of confirmed new cases, okay? As you can see, the peak occurred around mid-March, and since then the number is quite low. And as of November 10, Chuan-feng just updated this number, but still you can see that the total of the confirmed cases is only 500 or so. So this is like a miracle to many. And why? So people asking why. But where is Taiwan in the first place? Taiwan is on the west rim of the Pacific Ocean and is quite close to China. Okay, Taiwan has a population of 23.8 million people, the size between Florida and Texas. That means if Taiwan were the 51st state of the United States, then we will have around 30-ish electoral votes. With an area only a bit bigger than Maryland, Taiwan's density of the population is a lot higher than the average of the United States. And that means you have plenty of room for social distancing, okay? There were frequent exchange between Taiwan and China before the pandemic. 2.6 million people visit from China annually, and Taiwan in return has 4 million visitors going to China every year. And there are more than 400,000 Taiwanese working in China. Given the fact that Taiwan is in the vicinity of the epicenter of the early pandemic and the close tie between the two countries, many people thought at first that Taiwan might be the hardest hit country. And in the following two graphs, the paper published last month by researchers from your National Bureau of Economic Research demonstrates how well Taiwan is doing in COVID-19 pandemic. As isolated as its international status, Taiwan seems to be an extremely unique example, with so few people die from the COVID and still managing to have a positive GDP growth rate. Taiwan's case makes many people wonder, is Taiwan's success, at least temporarily, attributed to good policy or just lucky? To answer this question, we need to go back to the beginning of the pandemic and see how it unfolded in Taiwan. Okay. Taiwan's CDC official first learned from a social media platform that somebody acquired strange disease in Wuhan, China, in the early morning on December 31st, 2019. The onboard quarantine inspection at direct flights from Wuhan was quickly adopted at the same day. Okay, that's the December 31st. Later on, the border control measures were taken right before the Lunar New Year's Eve against people from Wuhan and later extended to Hubei. Okay, and other border control measures like outbound travel ban and also the ban on non-citizens entry. So beginning from the March, no foreigners can entering into Taiwan except some rare cases. For example, your maybe associate secretary of state visiting Taiwan during this period of time. And also, there are some so-called non-pharmaceutical disease control measures were taken during this period. And you can see that the Central Epidemic Command Center level 3 was activated on January 20th. And then it was raised to level 2 3 days after. And level 1 was announced on February 27th. During this early stage of the pandemic, many disease control measures were taken, such as the home quarantine and mandatory face mask, and also the ban on crowd gathering, etc. And among all the disease control measures, mask plays a crucial role. Considering the shortage of the mask for domestic use, export ban was first announced on January 24th, and the rationing system was implemented on January 28th. 2 masks a week were the amount everyone could get at the beginning. CECC then expropriated 66 private manufacturers on February 13th. In January, before government intervention, the production volume of the mask is 2 million per day. By the end of March, production capacity increases to 12 million masks per day. Then what caused Taiwan's temporary success? People usually would attribute the success to the factors commonly seen in other successful countries, such as the good communication or some non-pharmaceutical interventions. But there are also factors unique to Taiwan's case, which is national health insurance system and also the IT technology. Taiwan has a mandatory health insurance program, which forms a pretty robust healthcare system. Also, the National Health Insurance Information System provides possibility for rapid identification and tracking of suspected cases. And Taiwan is famous for its IT industry. We often heard that mobile phone tracking and big data analytics play an important role in combating COVID in Taiwan. Now, let me use the case of Diamond Princess Cruise as an example to explain why I just mentioned the NHI and also the IT system play some role in Taiwan's case. Okay, Diamond Princess Cruise was a ship docked in Taiwan on January 31st. And we later learned that the case 1 from Hong Kong was aboard the ship on January 20th. The case got fever and tested positive in Naha, Japan on the day after the cruise visited Taiwan. And nobody knew it until Japan media reported outbreak where many passengers tested positive during quarantine in Yokohama, Japan on February 5th. Now, we need to find a way to do this epidemiological investigation to see, to make sure if there's anyone in Taiwan who got infected by the possible cases from the cruise during their stay. What did they do? The official came up with a solution. They first asked 5 mobile phone companies to provide the numbers that registered to the cell tower near the harbor during the time period when the ship was moored in the harbor. In this way, 3,000 phones likely belonging to the cruise passengers and crew were identified. By the same method, the officials from CECC were able to draw a map showing the routes of those passengers and are able to identify potential contacts. Potential contacts were those who registered to the same cell towers at the same time when those passengers visited the places. So there were 627,386 phones identified. The identities of the phone owners were further provided by the phone companies to CECC. And then CECC could send text message to all of them, alerting their risk of being infected. CECC also used the National Health Insurance claims data to track the health status of all potential contacts and to provide some tests if they have some symptoms occurred. By this means, do you know how many cases they could identify? The answer is 0. Surprisingly, it's 0. So people asking whether the success of Taiwan's using high-tech tracking systems or a method is actually at the expense of due process of law, because the surveillance method used by the government included, among others, is the National Communication Commission, upon the request of CECC, demanded 5 private phone companies without the consent, and they turn in phone users' identifiable information, and noted that Taiwan does not adopt the third-party doctrine. And the second, the NHIA, which is the National Health Insurance Administration, provide identifiable NHI claim data to CECC to closely monitor the health status of those more than 600,000 people without their knowledge. Okay, and what's the legal basis for this surveillance method? CECC claimed that it is based on the Communicable Disease Control Act, Article 43. But indeed, Article 43 was authorized in 1944 for CDC to conduct traditional epidemiological investigation. But with that kind of authorization, could it be used to legalize mandatory secondary use of private information by NCC or NHIA? Would that be a proper legal ground? Could not be, because other law like Personal Data Protection Act and also the National Health Insurance Act itself, and also the Telecommunication Act, all said that there should be a purpose limitation principle. You shouldn't do this kind of a secondary use so easily. So as the legal basis for large-scale surveillance and other so-called creative disease control measures may be too tenuous. So CECC proposed a legislation to the legislature after the Diamond Princess incident. Okay, so this is what we call the Special Act, enacted on February 25th. This Article 7 of this Special Act reads like this: the commander of the CECC may take response actions or measures necessary for disease prevention and control. Okay. Article 7 may indeed an authorization of emergency power to the commander of the CECC. But we also have an emergency power clause in our constitution. The Article 2 of the Taiwan Constitutional Amendment says that the emergency power can be exercised when there is imminent danger affecting the security of the state or of the people, or any serious financial or economic crisis. But who can do that? Only the president. the president can take all necessary measures by issuing emergency decrees. And what's the procedure? Before issuing this decree, you need to get a resolution from the Executive Yuan Council. And after that, within 10 days of issuance, this decree needs to be presented to the Legislative Yuan. If the Legislative Yuan decline to ratify it, the said emergency decrees shall start to be valid. And there are also some restrictions imposed by our constitutional court on this kind of emergency power. The court said that the decree needs to be specific, clear, and precise before sending for ratification. Also, the proportionality principle remains applicable. Now let's go back to the Article 7 of the Special Act. Whether this kind of emergency power authorized to the commander of CCC is constitutional. There may be some constitutional weakness because this Article 7 authorized by the legislative branch to a person who is not the president of the state. And isn't the emergency power exclusively entrusted on the president by the Constitution? And I will come back to this point later. The second weakness is that Article 7 is a blanket authorization. Unlike presidential emergency decrees, the measures taken by the commander of the CCC need not be ratified by the legislature in its specific form. It's a blanket authorization. And third, even with the procedural safeguards laid down in the emergency clause of the TW, the Taiwan's constitution, and emergency power is still difficult to reign. Proportionality principle required by the constitutional court is indeed truthless, because it is very often depreciated to a rational basis test, even when fundamental rights are involved. But this is common to many, if not all, emergency decrees. It's not unique. It's not a unique problem of Article 7. So here comes the reason why I think the emergency power or the power to declare state of emergency should only be exercised by the head of a state. In a normal state, state power is under control by rule of law principles we impose on the government, and the state has to protect individual rights. When it is shifted to a state of emergency, it becomes a state of exception. Things that the government is not allowed to do in a normal situation would be much more permissible now. Even though we try to develop some tools to keep an eye on its exercise, emergency power proves to be too elusive to get hold. Also, the danger of normalizing the state of exception is greater when the line between the two states are blurred. We have witnessed the stretched interpretation of law by the CCC during the pandemic. It plants the seeds of power expansion for the government, even when the situation is back to normal. So my theory is this: in order to let the genie stay in the bottle, we need to ask the genie to give his or her promise before letting the genie out. An emergency declared officially by the president is the political commitment the president gives to the polity. And everything the president is permitted to do is only so in this state of exception. Of course, breaking a political commitment is not impossible. There is no guarantee that a president so promised will never turn into a tyrant. But the threat of a tyrant to democracy may be less than the threat of the populace that has become all too used to the psychological need of security that has loomed large in the state of emergency. Okay, the role of the head of state is indeed important here in the case of Taiwan. I just mentioned 4 factors to our temporary success, but none of them can really explain why Taiwan's situation is not as bad as the rest of the world. The real reason is actually a good political judgment based not on hard science, but common sense shared by many Taiwanese, which is be vigilant toward what the Chinese government claims or provides. Before the WHO declared COVID-19 as a public health emergency of international concern in March, or even before it recognized the outbreak at the end of January, Taiwan had already declared on January 15 the so-called severe pneumonia with novel pathogens as a statutory disease under our law, and allow for border control measures to be taken long before everyone else took any actions. That's because after learning some reports regarding the situation in Wuhan, Taiwan CDC official requested Chinese government on January 6 that our experts be sent there to investigate. Chinese government agreed the request 5 days later on January 11. 2 Taiwanese experts were permitted to go to Wuhan, but with very limited information provided. When you could not see what you want to see, when you could not get the information that is critical to answer the question of whether there was evidence proving or disproving human-to-human transmission, you should have some answers in your mind. 2 weeks after our presidential election, the incumbent and the winning president was able to close our border to Wuhan. If the result of the presidential election were different, where a pro-China party had won, the border to China might have not been closed that early, and I would not have been sitting here talking Taiwan's temporary success now. So it may sound harsh to some, but the truth may be that it is at least partially the good luck that puts Taiwan at the left bottom of the graph that I showed earlier in my talk. And there are still much to be learned from others' experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Chiou. I really appreciated that very thorough discussion of the Taiwanese situation. Professor Nguyen, we'd love to hear from you about an entirely different regime. How did Vietnam do it?
Great. Good morning, everyone from Pennsylvania. It is my great pleasure to be here today. As Rick said, the U.S. Asia Law Institute has been my intellectual home for almost a decade now, from my student days at NYU. So it is an honor to be part of this terrific series. So I'm going to talk about 3 things today. First, the COVID situation in Vietnam. Second, 4 key legal and policy issues that I think both shape Vietnam's successful response and highlight some of its structural weaknesses. And third, some concluding thoughts about Professor Hill's opening remark about government types. So first, the current situation. Enviable to perhaps those of us here in the US, Vietnam today is much closer to full reopening. While the national mandate for face covering and post-travel quarantine remain, schools, offices, and factories are open. My grandpa, who lives in Ho Chi Minh City, is back doing his morning walk and tea hours with his friends. People are cautious, but the traffic jams, the motorbikes, the noisy honking have all returned. As of today, Vietnam has fewer than 1,300 confirmed COVID-19 cases and 35 deaths. All the deaths have occurred during a second wave in July, meaning that for almost half a year, from January to July, it has managed to spare its people from the worst of the pandemic. So commentators have attributed Vietnam's effective response to a host of factors, which, as we have heard today and in the last seminar, also play important roles in successful stories elsewhere, including the government's early action to close schools and borders, extensive contact tracing, mass quarantine, past experience with SARS and MERS. A puzzle, however, still remains, at least in the case of Vietnam. What has enabled compliance with these restrictive measures? Anyone who has been to Vietnam knows that we still have not figured out how to make people line up in a queue. And in a single party state that is notorious for its struggle to enforce rules, what make 100 million people comply? So luck aside, certainly a role there. From a legal and governance perspective, I want to highlight what I think are 4 key issues. So first, often unexplored in Western press, Vietnam has engaged in decades-long effort to improve state capacity and responsiveness at local levels. This goes as far back as the Public Administration Reform Program in the mid-90s. In 2007, with the help from various aid agencies, it launched the Provincial Competitiveness Index program, where a team of experts collected data and ranked provincial leaders based on measures such as transparency, competency, responsiveness. Year over year, the index shows that Vietnamese provinces have made steady improvement in healthcare, in information access, in corruption control. Today, 90% of Vietnam's population have health insurance. COVID-19 tests and centralized quarantines, at least until very recently, were provided free of charge, which also help increase people's willingness to be tested and comply with quarantine measures. Second, building on the first point, this increased responsiveness at local level enables effective central-local coordination when it matters most. Immediately after it discovered the first COVID cases, the Vietnamese government formed a national COVID-19 response committee led by the Deputy Prime Minister, but located within the Ministry of Health, comprised of leaders from agencies ranging from science and agriculture to information and public securities. As it does with other party state administrative functions, this COVID-19 response committee replicates itself at all levels of government, down to the towns and wards, which are the smallest administrative unit. Key decisions on rationing ventilators, protective gears were coordinated and streamlined. And this mattered for the economy too, once early outbreaks were contained. Businesses were reoriented towards high demand areas, from textile to making masks and protective gears, agricultural business from growing decorative plants to consumable produce. Provinces coordinated with one another to promote linkage in the domestic market, including tourism, agriculture, seafood, which has become important as foreign consumption disappeared overnight. All these government actions, however, occur through a system of administrative documents, not through formal law. Third, returning to the question of compliance, Vietnam has an existing system of mass mobilization that it was able to reactivate. Without Taiwan's impressive healthcare and technology or South Korea's rapid and extensive testing, Vietnam's model has been called by some observers as low cost, relying on old-fashioned people as eyes and ears of the party state. The government reignited a mobilization campaign reminiscent of wartime exigency, characterizing the virus as a foreign enemy, which subtly, though not overtly, evoked anti-Chinese sentiments that was already running high due to the South China Sea conflict. But it also knew to learn from China. Similar to the Chinese response, Vietnam encouraged individuals and households to actively monitor quarantine violations. Mass civic organizations, once suffering from declining budgets after the war, have regained new purposes through anti-COVID-19 fundraising campaigns and community outreach. Neighborhood committees, a staple of socialist grassroots administrations, act as a combination of state agents and community organizers, usually composed of the local Communist Party bureaucrats and retired army officers. It now also includes local medical personnel. The members go knock on door to relay official policies, explain social distancing, collect household health and travel history, take people's temperatures. As with other countries, these helpful acts also raise questions about privacy, discrimination that have largely gone unaddressed. And finally, transparency. The Vietnamese government has been remarkably transparent in its COVID-19 efforts. There, I think it also learned from China's early cover-up debacle. Transparency efforts have mitigated some skepticism toward the party state's COVID-19 low numbers. The Ministry of Health disclosed online through its Facebook page all reported cases, enabling and even encouraging deeper analysis by data scientists and bloggers, gaining endorsement from public health experts. When a patient who tested positive for COVID-19 died from liver failure, the government used its Facebook portal to publicly discuss its reasoning for not counting his death as one of the COVID-19 deaths, publicly disclosing the fact that the patient has suffered from advanced liver dysfunction, had a series of negative tests before he died. So although undercounting is possible, and the government is highly aware, acutely aware that people are skeptical of its effort, public disclosures open up space for discussion and allow for correction if needed. Whether this transparency will outlast the pandemic is an open question. So to conclude, since I know I'm running out of time, I think Vietnam's story moves beyond the simple distinction of regime type to challenge us to think more deeply about state capacity within all forms of government. Its improving governance, central local policy coordination, and effective mass mobilization certainly helped Vietnam weather the worst of the pandemic so far. The VCP's transparency, at least when it comes to public health, has helped with its credibility. Now, my grandpa told me that he has not seen this level of support since the wars. Since 1975, the Vietnamese Communist Party has largely based its claim for legitimacy on a combination of achieving independence and economic development. Before 2020, widespread corruptions and various social unrests have damaged the party state's reputation. But the successful COVID-19 response seems to signal a shifting new basis for the leadership's legitimacy, one resting not on the remnants of war or economic development, but on indicia of bureaucratic competency. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much, Professor Nguyen. I see right now we're 7 minutes before the hour, and we're going to go 30 minutes after the hour, I think. So I'm just going to ask a question to the panel just to get started. Everybody's mentioned institutional rules. So for instance, Professor Wu mentions the fact that there's tension between the local government and the central government, but when the CDC comes in and says, hey, local government, change your behavior, the local government pretty much listens. And likewise, Professor Nguyen notes that, we have these rules about transparency, the information shared widely. So we see behavior from, governments that seem to follow rules. But I'm wondering why. I guess, why do you think that these governments do the things that you say make them perform well? And the reason I ask that is that Vietnam doesn't always follow the rules, right? The Vietnamese government enforces Article 117 of the Penal Code against anti-state speech all the time to censor people who say bad things about what's going on in Vietnam. So they're not transparent there, and they seem to violate constitutional rules on transparency. Why were they transparent here? I'm just curious about that, And likewise with Taiwan, it's great to hear that these local governments backed down when the CDC said, hey, we don't want you to over-test. But do local governments just always listen to what the central government says? Gosh, I want to drink some of that brand in the United States. It would be great if, for instance, I don't know, people listen to Dr. Fauci, put on a mask. So I'm just a little curious about what you think makes the system obey the formal rules. And, any comments from anyone on that issue would certainly be of great interest to me.
Okay, so I think I will first try to answer the question because it's kind of difficult question. It's a little complicated. And I think that first, why the local government obey the instruction from the CDC is that the central government actually have the power and they have the punishment to punish the civil officials if they don't obey the federal the central government rule. But as you just mentioned that if the local government got the support from the people, they can still try to disobey the orders from the central government. Actually, in the early stage of the COVID-19 outbreak in Taiwan, the local government actually tried to have different strategies from the central government's strategies. But the development of the COVID-19 is very fast. And eventually, it shows that the central government is right. So the local governments, their trust or from the society or their relation is kind of lower. So this kind of strengthens the central government's policy. And the other thing is that because Taiwan is doing quite well in this COVID-19 outbreak, so it kind of develops some kind of national pride. For example, that we have a slogan called Taiwan can help. So it shows that the society kind of develop some kind of ideas that we need to support the government to do things great in COVID-19 control. And the central government is doing so well, so we need to support it. So it's kind of different kind of factors, complicated factors influence the relationship between the local governments and the central government. And then the final thing is that during the 2003, the SARS outbreak struck Taiwan. During that time, there's some kind of difference between the Taipei city and the central government. And those kind of difference actually caused the outbreak becomes more serious in 2003. So during this time, whenever the central government says that the local government need to obey the orders from the central government, they always mentioned the SARS outbreak in 2003 and remind people that what happened there, the conflict between the local government and the central government is bad in disease control. So I think these kind of situations cause why the local government is quite humble in this event right now.
What do you think, Professor Nguyen?
I'd like to add something, or May, you want to go first?
No, go ahead. I'll go after you.
Okay, I'll add to Chuan-feng's observation about Taiwan's. I think he's right. We developed this kind of national pride so that we need to support our central government. And indeed, the commander of the CECC has become the national hero, not like Dr. Fauci in the States. Our Minister of the Health and Welfare becomes a hero. So I think in terms of the political strength, he had something to be put on the local government. So that's why Taiwan's case wouldn't create too much tension between the central and the local government. And also, Taiwan is not a federalist system, even though we have the central and local divisions, but it's not like the federal government and the state government, this kind of relationship. So that's the answer that I will add to Chuan-feng's observation.
Yeah, and I would just echo also the role of science and the kind of the claim for legitimacy through science as one of the key influence for Vietnam. And Professor Hills, you would be envious to hear this. So that actually was a CDC expert from the US in Vietnam that advised the Vietnamese government and was listened to. The perhaps ironically, American experts were listened to more so in Vietnam than they were in the United States. And on the point of transparency, I know we discussed a little bit before about strategic transparency. And here again, the timing and the timing of the pandemic, the way it hits Vietnam play a role there as well, because by the time that Vietnam discovered its first cases, the cat was already out of the bag in China. And so there was the Vietnamese leadership have learned from that debacle of a cover-up, and it knew that there was perhaps no point in trying to cover up COVID-19 anymore. It also perhaps mattered that the first cases were from Chinese tourists who were traveling in Vietnam, make it perhaps politically easier to publicly disclose these cases.
That's very, very interesting. You know, the question has arisen about the neighborhood committee in Vietnam. Sina Lu asks, the neighborhood committee is a critically important grassroots institution in China. I know that from personal experience because when I was in quarantine, my neighborhood committee came out to meet me. And when I got out of quarantine, they each gave me a big hug. And I thought that was so sweet. But they also put a camera right by my door, which is fine. So the question arises, how does it work in Vietnam? And does such a thing exist or some equivalent of it exist in Taiwan? Like a neighborhood committee that would have this kind of monitoring role. So I'm very curious about that. So I guess I'm going to ask that question next.
Yeah, so the neighborhood committees in Vietnam, kind of part of the stable socialist countries, also have roots in the Soviet Union back in the 60s. So at least the way it worked in what I know from my own experience is, so it's usually a unit. There was a head of the unit that was elected, but essentially elected within the Communist Party member of that local administrative unit. So the wards or the town or the provinces. And usually each committee is responsible for between 30 and 50 households. Normally it's composed of the local Communist Party member, retired army officials, people with some standing and status within the party. For COVID-19, they have also involved medical personnel from local hospitals. They go around knock on people's houses, keep a very extensive list of people who travel in and out of each household. And this, of course, raised a lot of privacy issues in the early days in these communist building, which is how housing are often done in the big city, in Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi. There were public lists posted at the front of the building about the people who come in and out, those who have contacts with people with COVID-19, not just first degree, but second, third degree, raised a lot of issues about privacy, about discriminations. But that's seems to be a common experience, not only in Vietnam, but also other countries that have activate these kind of grassroots organizations.
Anything like that in Taiwan?
Yes, we do have something similar to the neighborhood committee, but we don't call it neighborhood committee. We call it more like a village or the small division of a district. It usually there will be like 1,000 households consist of this kind of a unit. And the head of this unit will be in charge of handling logistics for the home quarantine. So like this head would be responsible for making sure that those who are in quarantine get food. So you will be sent bags of food in front of your door, and then you don't need to go out to get things to eat. And also, if you have some emergency, then you can contact this head to do it for you. But other than that, we also have quite strong support for those who are in need, especially when they are in quarantine. For example, we have set up these quarantine hotels for those who come back from abroad and need to find a place to stay for quarantine. Then you can go to this quarantine hotel with quite inexpensive charge. And also, the government can arrange public transportation for you. Actually, not really public transportation because you cannot take the public transportation. So they will find a cab for you to send you from the airport to this quarantine hotel and make sure that you will not affect others when you are in transportation. So this sort of logistic support system, I think, is quite functioning in Taiwan. And yeah, that's the part I want to give.
Well, this is all very encouraging, but some discouraging questions have come in, or maybe a little discouraging. Catherine asks, look, in Taiwan, some of the stuff that Taiwan's doing looks kind of scary. Electronic surveillance and data scraping and, pretty intense monitoring of people. Is there going to be a sunset clause for these things to disappear after the crisis exists? Or is this something that's going to be in Taiwan for a while? That's for our, Taiwanese experts. And for Professor Nguyen, look, you made a good argument that Vietnam has done a lot of institution building and increased local government capacity and also become more transparent. Will the transparency last after COVID goes away? Or is it really just a function of the prestige, as you say, of science or something COVID specific and therefore won't spread like COVID does sometimes to other parts of government? So those are sort of two questions about the persistence of the good or bad things that COVID has brought us.
I think I'll go first. Okay, regarding your first question, whether there's a sunset clause, yes, we have a sunset clause in our special act, saying that the act is good until June 30th next year. But the problem is that currently some so-called disease control measure or surveillance measures are not find the legal basis in this special act, but on other more general law, such as what I just mentioned. They think that the Communicable Control Disease Act is the basis, or they think that the Personal Data Protection Act itself already permits the government to do so. So all of this kind of expanded interpretation of the law is the sign that I said is the normalizing the state of exception. And this is quite alarming to me. And so whether there's a sunset clause for that all depends on whether what we did is actually only applicable in the state of emergency or not. But because we don't declare this kind of state of emergency officially, so the line becomes very blurred, and that's the question.
Professor Nguyen, will transparency last?
I hope so. I certainly hope so. I should say I am not optimistic on areas related to national securities issue, as you mentioned on before, but on other areas, certainly relating to public health, certainly relating to the economy. I think the experience of COVID-19 has shown the Vietnamese people and the leadership that public trust really matter, and transparency, consistent communication play a big role in that. And I should also mention the geopolitical factors. So very early on, General Secretary Chiou of Vietnam made the connection between Vietnam domestic success in responding to COVID-19 with its international standing, especially heightened in this era of South China Sea conflicts. So the leadership was making the point that for Vietnam as a country to have better standing in the international community, we have to strive to do well with our COVID-19 response. And transparency was made a key part of that. And certainly transparency efforts were praised in international press, creating perhaps, hopefully, one can hope, international pressure for the leadership to continue this trend.
Well, that's optimistic and encouraging. The question came in about health insurance in Vietnam from Nicholas Thomas. you mentioned that there's a lot of health insurance, and the question was about the role of public and private hospitals in Vietnam. You know, what proportion of healthcare is provided by each, and what do they do? And then another question from the same source, and this came up in the last week's session, KMT versus DPP in Taiwan. Do they disagree about COVID measures? Has there been partisan infighting? And we have a bit of that in the United States, you might have heard. And so it's naturally a matter of curiosity to we Americans about how partisan how partisan dynamics affect COVID response in Taiwan. So those are two questions respectively for our Taiwanese panelists and Professor Nguyen.
I can just say briefly about the hospital experience in Vietnam. So coordination happened there too. And because the number of COVID cases and COVID deaths were so low, the hospital never experienced a kind of devastating, overwhelming experience that some hospital in the United States had to go through. The Tropical for Disease and Control in Vietnam, which is a public institution, was deemed kind of the expert hospital on COVID. And so all the cases were transferred there. And so private and public hospital were able to funnel the critical cases to that one institution, allowing other hospital, private and public, to more or less resuming its normal function.
So Professor Chiou and Wu, what about party fighting?
Wen-Tsong, can you go first?
I think actually in the very beginning of the COVID-19 outbreak, actually the KMT and DPP, they have different opinions about border control. And the KMT tried to remain the relationship with China. And the DPP said that they want to have a strict border control. So actually they have a big fight about that. But I think during that time, Wen-Tsong just mentioned, it's about the presidential election in Taiwan. And also it's about the umbrella movement becomes more serious in Hong Kong. So Taiwanese people becomes more suspicious about this kind of situations. So actually, even though the KMT and DPP have the different ideas about the border control, but population and people kind of support that to have some kind of, I just mentioned, the precautionary approach toward China. And after that, because that, I also mentioned about the national pride, because actually Taiwan has kind of defended the first strike of the COVID-19 from China. So the DPP got the legitimacy to have the strict control, disease control measures. So the KMT didn't mention anymore, except one thing. The people from the Taiwan citizens, they are banned from entering from Wuhan to Taiwan. So KMT used this as some kind of cases to argue that the DPP government kind of left these people in China. And because the conflict between the DPP and the China communists, they don't have very good communication. So those people remained in China for like 6 months. So some people argue that their human rights is kind of restricted, and it's still an issue in Taiwan right now.
Well, Professor Chiou?
Yes, I think in addition to the border control difference among KMT and DPP, there are also some minor differences among them, but I would say the overall approach is pretty much the same, because they all can only rely on the so-called non-pharmaceutical interventions to do this. So either mask, social distancing, or testing, or maybe testing become an issue among them, because DPP prefers that you should be mindful of this false positive issues before given a widespread screening. So that may be the point that diverged. But other than that, I'll see that they are quite in common. Okay.
Now, Jerry Cohen has just asked this wide-ranging question. I'm also inclined to say, Jerry, do you want to ask it yourself? You've got your microphone there.
First comment was, this is a great program and the recording deserves the widest distribution. What I'm interested in is, when the pandemic passes, what will be the legal consequences? We've heard some very important questions raised about Taiwan especially, but also Vietnam, where the legal system isn't as important. And I'm wondering, what about the president's exclusive powers to declare an emergency? Will the much admired leader of the response to the pandemic replace the president as having the complete powers? And what about these absolutely awe-inspiring, frightening stories of surveillance techniques and the energetic implementation of the available technology? This is at once admiring, but very concerning for the future, and shows, if this is the situation available in Taiwan, what's it like on the mainland?
It's a very tough question to answer. So let me begin with the statement that I think the legal consequences after the pandemic, when the pandemic passes, the legal consequences, at least in Taiwan, I guess, will be is to open up a quite big room for the government to be able to a lot of things that we were not, we didn't imagine that the government could do. I'll give you some example. For this kind of electronic surveillance, the Taiwanese government currently is discussing issuing a so-called electronic ID card. With this ID card, all citizens will leave their digital footprints all over places whenever they are requested to present the ID cards, even it's on the virtual world. So I think the COVID-19 pandemic has created a precedent for the government to claim that people are used to it. So those who opposed this kind of strategy should not be opposed anymore. So that's the quite massive view, but that's what I can think of right now. So I will just end here.
And on Vietnam, let me just highlight one point, which is, as I mentioned before, most of the actions by the government was done through administrative document and not through law. And that has created a rather lively debate among the legal academia and professions about the need of institutionalized emergency power in law and go through the legal route rather than just through the administrative route. The consensus is that now is not quite the right time to raise that yet, to have that debate yet, as the country is still doing well so far, but still battling a second wave. But from what I heard, there's much hope to raise this issue once we are more firm, once Vietnam is more firm in the clear with the pandemic.
There was a global question asked early on, and it's a question that always occurs in these contexts. And I think, you could almost say people have two minds about it. I tend to be a skeptic, but maybe I'm too skeptical. And the question is, what's the role of culture? We're talking about the role of administrative documents or various, legal rules. But often the claim is, look, there's some cultural underpinnings to people's willingness to obey or not to obey. If Americans mob Lansing, the capital of Michigan, dressed in camouflage and carrying firearms, that's not because there's a law that encourages that. That's just about who we are, or who some of us are. It's part of the culture here. And so the question came, how much does some kind of collectivist culture, inevitably the C word comes in, Confucian culture, play in the various responses in Taiwan and Vietnam? As I say, I tend to be a skeptic. I think I said in the last session, I regard cultural explanations as that part of the map where you draw a big dragon because you actually don't have any information, a big sea serpent, or something. But maybe I shouldn't be so skeptical. Maybe this is something that really carries explanatory value and can be operationalized as something that's measurable and falsifiable. Do you guys have any thoughts about that? I'm just open.
Okay, I will go first. Actually, I have discussed this question, these ideas with my colleagues about what kind is the actual culture in Taiwan plays some important role about related to the disease control measures, especially Korea, Japan, and Taiwan or Vietnam, China. We all share similar culture. Is there something there? And because in Taiwan, the society kind of respect the experts or respect physicians. They trust experts very much. So they generally follow the orders from the experts, and they always trust the government. And also the society generally believes that the collective interest is more important or greater than individual roles. So under this kind of cultural influences, I think it's actually influenced Taiwan society's acceptance of the government some kind of strict disease control measures. But actually, my colleagues agreed with me. She argued that because during the SARS outbreak, the civil society actually disobeyed the government's rules. They try to argue that the strict measurement compared to other kind of the disease control measures in Canada, they think that Taiwan's measures is wrong, and they fight very seriously and fight very badly. So compared to the SARS outbreak and the COVID-19 outbreak, the civil society showed different kind of attitudes towards the government's policy. So culture maybe play a very important role in this outbreak this time, but I'm not sure if it's the essential factor. And we think that the Chinese factor plays an important role in this pandemic, and it kind of influenced Taiwanese society's attitudes toward the government's rule, because that is, as I just mentioned, because Taiwan is isolated from the international society for a long time, and we kind of do something good, and the international society finally noticed us, so we need to support the central government. So there are lots of different arguments here. So I don't have an answer right now, but I think it's a very interesting question.
Professor Nguyen, I'm very curious.
Yeah, so the really tough questions that I spent some time thinking about, and like like Professor Wu, I think I would agree that the China factor, the international factor certainly matter for Vietnam, especially as a single state party, single party country. It knew that it needed international support. On the question of culture, though, I've been thinking about the cost of breaking ties. So there's a lot of literature written about relational oppression, for example, in China. A lot of the restraint is done through relationship, through family, through community. So the cost of breaking relations is high, certainly high in Vietnam. And a lot of the relational compliance are relational through friends, through family, trying to get people to comply. Now, does that precede culture or is that part of culture? I'm not sure.
Well, I want to thank everybody. I think now my watch says we have 2 minutes left. Is that about right? 120 seconds. And I'm looking at the questions queue. I think if I'm not looking in the wrong place, I run through many of the questions. Somebody wants to have the last word right now. This would be a great time to have a last word. Otherwise, I am going to simply, I want to take one moment to point out that next week, we have Professor Greg Schaefer from Irvine going to talk about China's new economic order. You know, China was once based, the old model was based on massive investments in infrastructure. Professor Schaefer is going to talk about a new order based on bilateral agreements, overseas trade, and investment. And so that's a subject that's very interesting to me. Just talking to some bond traders in Shanghai who are talking about, to my surprise, massive overseas bond investors. You know, there's somebody in Cleveland who's buying Chinese bonds. Who knew? So I didn't realize there was that kind of market, but there apparently is. So I'm going to be here. I'm very curious about this topic, and I hope that a lot of you will be here as well. But now I see we have a minute or two left, a minute and 30 seconds left. I would love just to hear one final word from each of you about your thoughts on COVID in your countries. If you had one thing to leave people with.
Okay. I tried not to be so negative. So I still believe that the Chinese government still have a chance to improve our disease control measures. Especially, I think that's a problems we face right now, especially regarding the constitutional disputes. It's actually the old problems in new battle. And actually, this old problems was kind of ignored in the past. But the COVID-19 kind of bring people's attention to these old problems. So it's a good chance, even after the COVID-19 outbreak. I think it's a good chance for Taiwanese society to review these kind of problems.
Professor Chiou, you want to supplement what Professor Wu said about?
Yes, I think this is once in 100 years opportunity. So we think we need to seize this opportunity to review our ideologies and also our approach to what we have learned about the rule of law and make it stronger in a democracy. So that's the final words.
And Professor Nguyen.
Yeah, so I think my concluding thought would be, so for Vietnam, I think I'm cautiously optimistic. There's a sort of consensus, there's a recognition that there's a thought that Vietnam was underappreciated in the international realm because of its political system, because it is non-democratic. Its success was not recognized, at least early enough. So that's the hopeful part. And yet, you know, with the return of the state, with a much strengthened political system, with this reservoir of trust that the leadership have now built, we can only hope, one can hope that it will continue this trend of transparency, continue this trend of bureaucratic capacity, especially in this era of competing great power. Like Taiwan, Vietnam is thinking of itself that this is an opportunity and not to be caught between the great powers, but to capture some of the gains from its good effort with COVID.
Well, thank you so much. All those observations are somehow encouraging in a tough time, and really, in any case, very, very interesting. So I hope I see everybody here next week. Thanks a whole bunch, everyone. Special thanks to Professors Wu, Chiou, and Nguyen. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.